Okay, let's dive into something really puzzling today. Imagine this scenario, drawn right from the sources we looked at. Two neighborhoods right next door in Chicago. On the surface, they look remarkably similar. Comparable economic stats, demographics, facing a lot of the same systemic issues.
Right, the kind of places you might expect to have similar outcomes in many ways.
Exactly. And yet, one of them has double the shootings per capita compared to the other. Twice as many.
Wow, double. That's a huge difference.
It really is. And the question is why? If the usual things we talk about, poverty, lack of jobs, gun availability, all those big social factors, if they don't fully explain such a stark difference between two places that seem so alike, well, what else is going on?
And that specific puzzle, which is really central to the work we're digging into, it challenges some pretty basic ideas about why gun violence happens and maybe even more importantly, how we might actually, stop it.
Precisely. So today we're doing a deep dive into that question. We're guided by the insights from behavioral economist Jens Ludwig, particularly from his book Unforgiving Places, based on the materials provided.
Yeah, and his argument, the core of it, is that maybe the conventional ways we think about gun violence are, well, maybe they're missing something important.
Right. Our mission here is to unpack that, to understand why Ludwig thinks the usual explanations fall short, and how this behavioral science lens offers a different, maybe even faster way to intervene, to save lives right now.
It means looking beyond just the long-term root causes, as vital as those are, and thinking about the immediate situation, the place, the environment, the psychology of that exact moment when violence might erupt.
Okay, so let's start with that Chicago example again, Greater Grand Crossing and South Shore. The source mentions Ludwig, who actually lived nearby and studied these areas closely.
Right, he had firsthand experience.
No, he was really struck by this difference. Greater Grand Crossing, way higher gun violence, double South Shore's rate. Right. But the data, similar poverty, similar unemployment, similar racial makeup, all these factors we usually point to.
So the typical explanations just weren't cutting it. They didn't explain that massive gap between these two adjacent communities. It really throws a wrench in the works, doesn't it?
It really does. And this leads Ludwig, based on his analysis described in the source, to look at the dominant narratives, the sort of conventional wisdoms about gun violence.
Yeah, he identifies two main camps, broadly speaking. First, there's what the source calls the conventional wisdom of the right.
Okay, what's the gist there?
Well, it often centers on individual blame. The idea is that violence is committed by, quote, bad people, individuals who maybe lack morals or don't fear the consequences.
So the solution from that viewpoint is mainly legal. Harsher sentences, more prison time, basically making the cost of violence too high.
Exactly. Deterrence through punishment is kind of the main tool.
Okay, and the other side. The source mentions the perspective, often linked with the political left.
Right. That view tends to emphasize the bigger picture, the systemic issues. It argues that violence is often rooted in things like economic desperation, lack of opportunity, inequality.
The idea being that people turn to violence because they feel they don't have other options, or maybe because of the sheer stress of living in poverty.
Precisely. And the solutions proposed there usually involve large-scale social change. Job programs, community investment, tackling poverty, addressing those deep root causes.
Got it. So two very different explanations and proposed solutions. But Ludwig's critique, according to the source material, finds a common thread.
Yes, and this is crucial. Despite focusing on totally different things, bad individuals versus bad systems, he argues both views fundamentally assume something similar about the act of violence itself.
Which is?
That the person engaging in gun violence in that moment is making a deliberate choice, a rational calculation, or at least a premeditated one. Okay, so whether it's weighing the risk of jail time or feeling like violence is the only way out, both imply some level of conscious thought or planning beforehand.
Exactly. But Ludwig says, hold on. Based on the evidence, especially for interpersonal shootings that flare up from arguments, that assumption might often be wrong.
How so?
He argues people aren't necessarily thinking clearly or rationally in the heat of an argument. Emotions run high, things escalate fast.
And if there's a gun easily available in that exact moment,
then a conflict that might otherwise have ended in shouting, maybe a shove, or even fists, can suddenly become deadly. It's that combination. Intense emotion, maybe impaired judgment, plus immediate access to lethal force. That's the deadly mix.
Okay, so if it's often not this cold, calculated decision, what's driving it? This seems to be where Ludwig's behavioral perspective really comes into play, the unexpected origins part. That's right. His core argument, drawing from the source material, is that a lot of this gun violence is better understood as an automatic, almost reactive response. It's triggered by the stress of the situation and the immediate environment.
And he links this to the chronic stress and trauma that people experience in high-violence communities.
Yes, exactly. The source explains this really well. Living under constant threat, instability, witnessing violence, it takes a toll. It acts like a constant tax on your brain's resources.
He calls it depleting mental bandwidth.
Right. It's a great term.
Yeah.
Think of it like trying to run too many programs on an old computer.
Yeah.
If your brain is constantly using up resources just to cope, to stay alert, to manage daily stress,
There's less capacity left for other things.
Yeah.
Like controlling impulses or thinking through consequences in a tense moment.
Precisely. Your ability to regulate emotions, to think clearly, to make reasoned choices under pressure, it gets compromised.
So it's not just feeling stressed, it's that the cognitive machinery itself is overloaded.
Yeah. And that makes people more vulnerable to reacting automatically, maybe instinctively, aggressively, when faced with conflict. It shifts the focus from why someone might be prone to violence generally to how their immediate state and surroundings make them susceptible in that specific heated moment.
Less about deep intent, more about a moment of impaired judgment under extreme pressure.
That's the idea, a moment of compromised decision-making.
Okay, so if a lot of gun violence is this kind of reactive thing tied to fleeting moments,
Yeah.
then the solutions Ludwig proposes, as the source describes them, look quite different too.
Very different from just focusing on, say, mass incarceration or waiting for huge societal changes like ending poverty, which he agrees are important goals, but they're incredibly slow and complex.
So what's the alternative he suggests for the short term?
He argues for focusing on immediate behavioral interventions, right there in the places where violence is most likely to happen, intervening just before it potentially erupts.
How do you do that? Intervene behaviorally in a specific place.
Well, his main strategy, based on the evidence discussed in the source, is about increasing what's famously called eyes on the street.
Jane Jacobs, right. But it's not about surveillance cameras everywhere.
No, not primarily. It's about fostering a natural, positive human presence. Creating conditions where more ordinary people feel comfortable being out and about in public spaces. These people then act as informal guardians.
How does that work in practice? The source gave some examples, didn't it?
Yeah, really interesting ones from randomized experiments that Ludwig highlights, like in Philadelphia, turning derelict, vacant lots, overgrown, trashy areas into small, clean, green parks.
Okay. Seems simple enough.
And another one in New York City, just adding more streetlights in high crime areas. Again, seems basic.
So better lighting in tiny parks. How does that stop shootings?
Well, the insight, according to the source, is how they work. It wasn't just that the places looked nicer or were better lit. It was that these changes made people feel safer, more willing to actually use those spaces.
Ah, so people start spending more time outside. Sitting in the park, walking home later under the lights, maybe just hanging out on their porch.
Exactly. More people going about their normal lives means more informal eyes on the street. More chances that if an argument starts to brew, someone is nearby.
Someone who might notice, might say something, might call for help, or just their presence alone might make people pause.
Right. It increases that subtle social monitoring and the potential for interruption just by having more ordinary activity around. A small environmental tweak can ripple outwards.
Interesting. And the source also mentioned that this framework supports more direct interventions too, like placing specific people in hotspots.
Yes, it does. So beyond just encouraging more general public presence, Ludwig's analysis also supports strategically placing people like police officers, but also, importantly, trained violence interrupters or outreach workers.
People whose job it is to actively look for trouble brewing and step in.
Exactly. To de-escalate conflicts before they reach that point of no return, especially when a weapon might be involved. It's adding a layer of targeted, proactive intervention.
And Ludwig apparently sees this as validating work that's already happening.
Yeah, the source notes he points to examples like Chicago's Light in the Night events.
What are those?
Basically, community groups reclaiming public spaces in high-crime neighborhoods with positive activities, barbecues, music, just bringing people together. It aligns perfectly with this idea. Increase positive presence, increase intervention capacity, right where and when it's needed most.
Okay, let's step back. The so what moment. What are the bigger implications here? The source stresses the urgency, right? People need solutions now.
Absolutely. Communities dealing with violence can't always wait for the decades it might take for massive social change. This behavioral approach offers something tangible, evidence-based, that can potentially have an impact much sooner.
Especially, I suppose, when resources for huge programs are tight.
Right. And there's a fundamental insight here from behavioral economics, as Ludwig presents it in the source material, that really challenges a common kind of pessimistic assumption.
Which is?
Well, the conventional idea that violence comes from deep, persistent problems often implies that even if you stop one incident, the underlying motivation is still there. You know, violence interrupted is just violence delayed.
Like the person will just find another time or place.
Yeah, but if Ludwig is right that much of this violence is reactive, triggered by a fleeting situation and compromised thinking.
Then the motivation itself might be fleeting, tied only to that specific moment.
Exactly. So if you successfully interrupt it in that moment, the argument cools down, people walk away, the immediate trigger passes, then the violence is prevented, not just postponed. That window of opportunity for that specific violent act closes.
That's actually a much more hopeful perspective.
It is. And Ludwig suggests, according to the source, that this provides a scientific underpinning for what savvy practitioners have often figured out intuitively on the ground.
Like the violence interrupters and community groups.
Right. He suggests behavioral economics helps explain why their strategies stepping into fights, creating safe zones, flooding areas with positive presence actually work. It gives a why to the what they're doing.
Science validating the street smarts. In a way.
You could put it that way. And the source also suggests these immediate front-end fixes aren't just temporary band-aids.
How so?
By making neighborhoods feel safer and more stable right now, they can actually create a better foundation for those longer-term solutions like education or job programs to actually succeed. It helps create an environment where deeper change can take root.
Makes sense. You need some level of immediate safety for other things to work.
For sure.
So connecting it all back, Ludwig's work, based on what we've read, isn't saying ignore the big problems or forget accountability. It's adding another layer.
Yeah, a crucial layer.
Yeah.
Focusing on the immediate triggers the environment, the cognitive state, the behavior in the moment, and finding practical ways to break that chain reaction just before it turns deadly.
So the core takeaway from this deep dive seems to be this potential shift. Think about gun violence not only as a result of deep, unchanging causes or something to just punish after the fact, but also as often a reactive behavior.
A behavior susceptible to interruption in the moment, particularly by changing the immediate social and physical environment.
Which leads to a really interesting final thought for you, the listener, something to chew on, drawing from all this. If places that look so similar on paper can have such wildly different violence rates, like that Chicago example, and if interrupting a fleeting reactive moment can actually prevent violence, not just delay it, what might that behavioral lens tell us about other tough social problems?
Problems we usually blame solely on deep, persistent issues.
Are there other areas where we might be missing opportunities for immediate, effective interventions? Because we're not looking closely enough at the specific environment, the context, the behavioral triggers of the moment?
A lot to think about there. This has definitely offered a compelling and maybe more optimistic way to look at an incredibly difficult issue.